racism and oppression are not born in the present. They are legacies passed down through generations, ingrained in the fabric of societies that have long profited from division and inequality. The struggles faced today by marginalized communities are echoes of a past that was built on exploitation, segregation, and dehumanization. The history of racism is not just a distant memory, but a living reality that continues to shape the world. From slavery to colonization, from Jim Crow laws to apartheid, history has shown time and again how systems of oppression are designed to strip people of their dignity, opportunities, and in many cases, their very lives. Though laws have changed and overt discrimination is less tolerated in many places, the remnants of those historical injustices remain deeply embedded in institutions, mindsets, and economic structures. The past does not stay in the past. Generations who endured slavery and forced labor passed down their pain, resilience, and struggle to their children. And those children grew up in a world that still sought to limit their potential. The segregation of schools, the redlining of neighborhoods, the denial of voting rights. Each of these policies was crafted to ensure that the effects of racism would persist long after legal slavery was abolished. Even as overtly racist laws were repealed, their consequences did not simply disappear. Black and indigenous communities, along with other marginalized groups, continue to face systemic disadvantages, from wealth disparities to limited access to quality education and health care. The economic impact of centuries of discrimination is evident today in wage gaps, employment barriers, and generational poverty, making it clear that historical injustices are not merely history, but present-day obstacles. The psychological scars of oppression run just as deep as the economic ones. When a people have been told for centuries that they are inferior, that they are less deserving, that their voices do not matter, the effects manifest in ways that reach beyond material wealth. The trauma of racial violence, the exclusion from mainstream narratives, the constant battle to prove one's worth, all these weigh heavily on the spirit of those who have been oppressed. A child growing up in a world where people who look like them are underrepresented in positions of power, where history books barely acknowledge their ancestors' contributions, where the media portrays them through harmful stereotypes, internalizes messages that can take a lifetime to unlearn. That psychological burden is part of the legacy of historical injustice. The legal system, too, bears the imprint of history. Laws that once explicitly sanctioned discrimination have been replaced by policies that continue to disproportionately harm marginalized communities. Mass incarceration, racial profiling, and disparities in sentencing all serve as modern extensions of past injustices. The very institutions meant to serve and protect are often the same ones that perpetuate harm, reinforcing the same hierarchies that were established centuries ago. The criminalization of black and brown bodies is not accidental. It is a continuation of systems designed to control and suppress. When a justice system disproportionately arrests, convicts, and sentences people of color at higher rates, it is not merely an issue of individual prejudice, but the result of a long-standing structure that has been built to maintain racial inequality. Education has long been a battleground in the struggle against racism. Schools in underprivileged neighborhoods, many of them attended by students of color, are often underfunded and lack the resources needed to provide quality education. The disparity in educational opportunities is not a coincidence. It is another consequence of historical injustice. When children are denied a proper education, they are denied access to the tools they need to break free from the cycle of poverty and discrimination. Education has the power to liberate, but when it is withheld from certain communities, it becomes yet another tool of oppression. The fight for equal education is not just about textbooks and school buildings. It is about dismantling the remnants of a past that sought to keep certain groups in perpetual disadvantage. Even in everyday interactions, history casts a long shadow. The prejudices that people hold today are not formed in isolation, but are inherited from centuries of racial narratives designed to justify oppression. The fear, distrust, and biases that continue to persist are direct results of a history that taught one group to see themselves as superior and others as lesser. Undoing those ingrained beliefs requires more than just legislation. It requires an honest reckoning with the past and an intentional effort to change the way people view one another. The struggle against racism is not just about addressing the present, but about confronting the deep and painful history that created the present conditions. Only by acknowledging and addressing the racism is not simply a matter of personal bias or individual prejudice. It is deeply embedded in the systems and institutions that govern society. Systemic racism operates through laws, policies, and practices that disadvantage certain racial groups while privileging others. These institutional barriers are not always visible or explicitly racist, yet their effects are undeniable, shaping the opportunities, resources, and rights that different communities can access. From education and employment to healthcare and criminal justice, systemic racism continues to perpetuate inequality and oppression, often without being openly acknowledged by those who do not experience its effects firsthand. One of the most significant areas where systemic racism is evident is in the economy. Wealth disparities between racial groups have persisted for generations, largely due to discriminatory practices that have limited access to home ownership, business loans, and high-paying jobs. Redlining, a practice that systematically denied Black and other marginalized communities access to home loans and property ownership, ensured that certain neighborhoods remained impoverished while others flourished. These practices did not just affect one generation, they created long-term economic disadvantages that continue to impact families today. A lack of generational wealth means fewer resources for education, business opportunities, and home ownership, perpetuating a cycle of poverty that is incredibly difficult to escape. Even when laws changed, the damage had already been done, and new barriers such as predatory lending and wage discrimination arose to maintain economic disparity. Education is another institution where systemic racism plays a major role in maintaining inequality. Schools in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods receive less funding, fewer resources, and often lack experienced teachers, leading to lower educational outcomes and reduced opportunities for students. The quality of education a child receives is often directly tied to their zip code, which in turn is influenced by decades of housing discrimination. This means that marginalized communities are often trapped in underfunded schools with fewer opportunities for advanced coursework, extracurricular activities, and college preparation programs. The school-to-prison pipeline, which disproportionately pushes Black and Latino students out of schools and into the criminal justice system, further demonstrates how systemic racism operates within educational institutions. Harsh disciplinary policies, such as suspensions and expulsions, are disproportionately applied to students of color, reinforcing cycles of disadvantage and making it harder for them to succeed academically. The criminal justice system is one of the most glaring examples of institutional racism, with disparities in policing, sentence, and incarceration rates disproportionately affecting communities of color. Black Americans are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and sentenced to longer prison terms for the same offenses as their white counterparts. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws, 3 strikes policies, and cash bail systems disproportionately impact marginalized communities, keeping individuals in a cycle of incarceration and economic hardship. The war on drugs, which was framed as a means of reducing crime, has overwhelmingly targeted Black and Latino populations, leading to mass incarceration and the destruction of families and communities. Even after serving their sentences, formerly incarcerated individuals face barriers to employment, housing, and voting rights, further perpetuating systemic oppression. Healthcare disparities further highlight the impact of systemic racism, with marginalized communities facing higher rates of illness, lower access to quality medical care, and worse health outcomes overall. Black women, for example, are far more likely to die from childbirth complications than white women, not because of biological differences, but due to systemic neglect, lack of access to quality health care, and implicit biases within the medical community. Many healthcare facilities in underprivileged areas suffer from underfunding, lack of resources, and overburdened staff, leading to inadequate care. The COVID-19 pandemic further exposed these disparities, with communities of color experiencing higher infection and mortality rates due to limited access to health care, crowded living conditions, and employment in essential jobs that increased exposure risks. Voting rights have long been manipulated to suppress the voices of marginalized communities. Tactics such as voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and the purging of voter rolls disproportionately impact Black, Latino, and indigenous voters, making it more difficult for them to participate in the democratic process. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a major victory in the fight against racial oppression, but recent efforts to weaken its protections have led to renewed concerns about voter suppression. When a group's ability to vote is restricted, their access to representation, resources, and legislative change is severely limited, allowing systemic racism to persist unchecked. The impact of institutional racism extends beyond individuals. It affects entire communities, shaping their economic stability, access to quality education, interactions with law enforcement, health outcomes, and political influence. These barriers are not accidental, but the result of policies designed to maintain existing power structures. Without actively dismantling these systems and addressing the root causes of inequality, true racial justice cannot be achieved. Acknowledging the existence of systemic racism is only the first step. Meaningful change requires deliberate efforts to challenge and reform the institutions that continue to uphold racial oppression. Sting impact of historical injustice. Can true equality ever be achieved? The psychological and emotional toll of racism and oppression runs deep, leaving scars that can last for generations. The burden of being constantly judged, excluded, and devalued weighs heavily on individuals and communities. It is not just about the overt acts of discrimination, but also about the subtle, everyday indignities that reinforce a sense of inferiority. Microaggressions, dismissive attitudes, and systemic barriers all contribute to a sense of being unwelcome or unworthy. These experiences accumulate over time, shaping self-perception and limiting the belief in one's own potential. The damage is not just external, but internal, affecting the mind, body, and spirit in ways that are often overlooked. Racial trauma is real and manifests in ways similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. The stress of experiencing or witnessing racism repeatedly can lead to anxiety, depression, and even physical health issues. When individuals are made to feel that they are less than others simply because of their race, it creates an internal struggle between self-worth and societal perception, the feeling of constantly having to prove oneself. To work twice as hard for half the recognition drains emotional and mental energy. Living in a society that treats certain groups as lesser can create deep-seated feelings of frustration, anger, and helplessness. This internalized oppression can make people doubt their abilities, question their worth, and suppress their ambitions. One of the most harmful effects of racism is the way it impacts the self-esteem of children. From a young age, children of color are often exposed to messages that suggest their culture, language, and appearance are less desirable. The lack of positive representation in media, literature, and history books reinforces this narrative. When children do not see themselves reflected in positions of power, success, and intelligence, they may begin to internalize the idea that greatness is not meant for them. This can result in a lack of confidence, a reluctance to take risks, and a diminished sense of belonging in academic and professional spaces. The effects of this conditioning can last a lifetime, influencing career choices, aspirations, and personal development. Racial stereotypes add another layer of emotional burden. The pressure to defy stereotypes while simultaneously battling discrimination creates a constant mental and emotional conflict. People of color are often expected to behave in ways that conform to societal expectations, whether it is being extra polite to avoid being labeled as aggressive, or working harder to disprove assumptions of incompetence. This performance of acceptability is exhausting and dehumanizing. The need to constantly monitor one's actions, words, and even body language in order to avoid negative assumptions creates a heightened sense of stress and anxiety. The fear of being judged unfairly, of being followed in a store, of being dismissed in a conversation, or of being presumed guilty before even speaking takes a toll on mental well-being. The long-term psychological impact of racism extends beyond the individual, affecting entire families and communities. Generational trauma is passed down when parents who have endured racism and oppression struggle to shield their children from the same pain. The lessons of survival often come with warnings. Be careful how you dress, watch how you speak, don't give them a reason to fear you. These warnings are necessary for protection, but they also instill a deep awareness that society does not treat everyone equally. The constant state of vigilance required to navigate a world filled with racial biases adds a layer of exhaustion that is difficult to escape. Coping with the emotional and psychological effects of racism requires immense strength and resilience. Many communities have developed ways to counteract these negative experiences through cultural pride, activism, and collective healing. Celebrating one's identity, reclaiming history, and finding support in community spaces provide a sense of empowerment and belonging. Therapy and mental health support are also critical, though access to such resources is often limited due to systemic barriers. The stigma around mental health in many marginalized communities further complicates the ability to seek help. The need for safe spaces where individuals can process their experiences without fear of dismissal or invalidation is vital in the journey toward healing. Healing from racial trauma is not just the responsibility of those who experience it. Societies must acknowledge the mental and emotional harm caused by racism and take active steps to dismantle the structures that perpetuate it. This means changing the way history is taught, ensuring representation in all areas of life, and addressing disparities in mental health support. Creating an environment where people of all races feel valued, heard, and respected is necessary for true progress. Only by recognizing the full impact of racism, including its psychological toll, can meaningful change take place. Throughout history, the power of resistance and activism has been the force that challenges oppression and demands justice. Oppressive systems do not dismantle themselves. They are confronted by the voices of those who refuse to accept inequality. The struggles against racism have been met with courage, determination, and unyielding resilience from individuals and movements that believe in the dignity of all people. Resistance does not always take the form of grand demonstrations. Sometimes it is in the quiet defiance of an individual who refuses to be treated as less than human. It is in the small acts of rebellion that grow into revolutions, in the stories told to inspire future generations, in the collective will to refuse silence in the face of injustice. The legacy of resistance is carried by those who have stood against systems designed to oppress them, enslaved people who risked their lives to escape and free others, activists who endured violence to march for civil rights, and writers who used their words to expose the realities of racism, all played roles in shaping a world that moves closer to justice. Harriet Tubman led hundreds to freedom despite the constant threat of capture and death. Frederick Douglass used the power of literacy to dismantle the falsehood that enslaved people were incapable of intellectual thought. The Harlem Renaissance gave birth to artists and thinkers who refused to allow black culture to be erased or diminished. The civil rights movement of the 1960s saw people like Martin Luther King, Jr. Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and countless others challenge segregation, discrimination, and injustice with strategies that included peaceful protests, legal battles, and self-defense. Activism has never been a singular effort. It thrives on community, on the unity of people who recognize that their struggles are intertwined. The Montgomery bus boycott was not successful because of one individual. It was powerful because thousands of people refused to use the bus system for over a year, choosing sacrifice over submission. The lunch counter sit-ins were not isolated acts of defiance. They were coordinated efforts that involved students, mentors, and legal advocates. The freedom rides, voter registration drives, and marches across bridges where violence was met with unwavering determination all demonstrated that true change requires collective action. The power of resistance is not limited to any one era. Modern movements continue to carry forward the fight against racism and oppression, adapting to new challenges while using the lessons of the past. The Black Lives Matter movement emerged as a response to the systemic violence against Black communities, calling attention to police brutality, racial profiling, and the devaluation of Black lives in legal and social systems. It is not just a movement of protest, but of policy change, education, and global solidarity. The call for justice has expanded beyond individual cases to demand an overhaul of the systems that allow racism to persist. Resistance does not only happen in the streets, it happens in classrooms, courtrooms, and boardrooms. Educators who teach the truth about history despite efforts to suppress it, lawyers who fight for the rights of the marginalized, and business leaders who break barriers in industries that have long excluded people of color, all play a role in activism. Representation in media, politics, and literature shapes narratives and challenges the stereotypes that have long been used to justify discrimination. Each time a voice speaks truth to power, it chips away at the foundation of oppression. The cost of activism is often high. Many who have stood against racism have faced imprisonment, violence, loss of livelihoods, and even assassination. Their sacrifices are reminders that justice is not freely given, it is demanded. The struggle requires persistence, for those who benefit from oppression will not relinquish power willingly. The backlash against progress is real, but history has shown that resistance is stronger than repression. Hope is woven into the fabric of activism. Every step taken toward justice, no matter how small, is a declaration that racism and oppression will not have the final word. The work is never finished, but each generation builds upon the victories of those who came before. Resistance is an ongoing journey, a continuous fight for a world where dignity is not dictated by race, where equality is not a dream but a reality. It is in the hands of those who refuse to be silent, those who dare to believe that change is not only possible, but inevitable. The power of solidarity in the face of racism and oppression is one of the greatest tools for justice and change. No movement has ever succeeded without the collective efforts of people who understand that the struggle against injustice is not the burden of one group alone. When people from all walks of life stand together, recognizing that inequality anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, they create a force that cannot be ignored. Solidarity is the act of uniting across racial, cultural, and national lines to fight against systems that seek to divide, dehumanize, and oppress. It is not just a moral responsibility, it is a necessary strategy for dismantling deeply entrenched structures of discrimination. History is filled with examples of how solidarity has been a driving force in the fight against racism. The abolitionist movement was not only led by formerly enslaved individuals, but also by allies who recognized that slavery was an affront to humanity. White and Black activists worked together to operate the Underground Railroad, providing safe passage to those seeking freedom. Writers and speakers, regardless of race, used their voices to challenge the status quo and push for the end of human bondage. The civil rights movement of the 20th century saw people of different racial backgrounds marching side by side, enduring beatings, arrests, and threats, because they understood that segregation was a national disgrace, not just a Black issue. Clergy, students, labor unions, and international allies all played roles in demanding an end to legal discrimination. Solidarity is not just about standing with others in moments of crisis. It is about actively working to dismantle the conditions that create oppression. This means educating oneself about history, privilege, and the realities faced by marginalized communities. It means using one's position, whether in a workplace, a school, or a government office, to challenge discriminatory practices. It is about amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced, ensuring that their stories are heard and their struggles acknowledged. True solidarity is not performative. It is not about temporary outrage or symbolic gestures. It requires continuous commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to engage in difficult conversations, even when it is uncomfortable. Allies play a critical role in challenging racism within their own communities. Too often, those who are not directly affected by oppression remain silent out of fear, indifference, or ignorance. But silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Speaking out against racism should not be the sole responsibility of those who experience it firsthand. White allies, in particular, have the ability to challenge prejudiced thinking among their peers, to confront discrimination in spaces where people of color may not be present, and to leverage their privilege in ways that create meaningful change. True allyship is not about pity or saviorism. It is about recognizing a shared humanity and fighting for justice as a fundamental right for all. Solidarity is also international. Racism and oppression are not confined to one country or one people. They exist across the world in different forms. Colonialism, apartheid, ethnic discrimination, and systemic exclusion have impacted societies globally. Movements for racial justice have often drawn inspiration from one another, learning strategies and sharing messages of resistance. The struggles of Black South Africans against apartheid echoed the civil rights movement in the United States. Indigenous communities fighting for land and sovereignty share common ground with marginalized groups resisting displacement and economic exploitation. The fight against racism is interconnected, and victories in one part of the world create ripple effects that inspire others to push forward in their own battles. Solidarity is about more than just recognizing injustice. It is about taking action to correct it. It is about showing up, whether that means marching in the streets, voting for policies that promote equality, supporting businesses owned by marginalized communities, or simply refusing to remain silent when witnessing discrimination. It is about ensuring that the next generation inherits a world where justice is not an exception but a standard. When people stand together, refusing to be divided by hate, the power of solidarity becomes an unstoppable force. The fight for equality is not one that can be won alone, but together it becomes possible to create a world where oppression has no place and justice is the foundation upon which society is built. The role of education in dismantling racism and oppression cannot be overstated. Knowledge is one of the most powerful weapons against ignorance, prejudice, and systemic injustice. Racism is not an inherent trait. It is learned through generations of misinformation, stereotypes, and deliberate exclusion from historical narratives. When people are taught falsehoods about race, they internalize biases that shape their perceptions and interactions with others. Education has the power to challenge these ingrained beliefs, to replace myths with truth, and to equip individuals with the critical thinking skills necessary to recognize and combat discrimination. When history is taught honestly and comprehensively, it forces societies to confront their past, acknowledge their wrongs, and commit to building a future rooted in equality. A distorted version of history has often been used to justify oppression. The erasure of the contributions of marginalized communities, the glorification of figures who upheld racist systems, and the omission of resistance movements all contribute to a narrative that reinforces inequality. When people grow up believing that their ancestors had no agency, that their culture is inferior, or that their suffering was necessary for progress, it shapes their sense of identity and possibility. Conversely, when education includes the achievements, struggles, and resilience of all people, it fosters a sense of pride, belonging, and empowerment. Knowing that great thinkers, scientists, artists, and leaders have emerged from every race and culture dismantles the notion that intelligence or excellence belongs to one group alone. The importance of representation in education extends beyond history books. Literature, media, and classroom discussions shape the way people understand the world and their place within it. When children see themselves reflected in stories of triumph, innovation, and leadership, they believe in their own potential. When students are exposed to diverse perspectives, they develop empathy and understanding for those whose experiences differ from their own. Education that includes multiple narratives prevents the dehumanization that allows racism to persist. It teaches that no culture is superior, that no people are inherently less deserving of dignity, and that justice requires an active effort from all members of society. Critical thinking skills are essential in the fight against racism. Education must go beyond memorization of facts and encourage students to analyze the structures that maintain inequality. It must challenge them to question policies, media portrayals, and laws that perpetuate discrimination. When people are taught to think critically, they are less susceptible to propaganda, fear-mongering, and the divisive tactics that uphold oppression. They recognize coded language in politics, they see through misleading narratives, and they are equipped to advocate for policies that promote true equality. An educated society is one that refuses to accept injustice as normal, one that demands accountability from those in power, and one that actively works to break cycles of oppression. Access to quality education is a fundamental right, yet systemic racism has long created barriers that prevent marginalized communities from receiving the same opportunities as others. Underfunded schools, discriminatory policies, and a lack of resources disproportionately impact students of color, making it harder for them to reach their full potential. The achievement gap is not a reflection of intelligence or ability. It is the result of generations of exclusion, economic disparity, and neglect. When education is truly equal, when all students have access to the same level of instruction, mentorship, and opportunities, then the foundation of racism begins to crumble. Lifelong education is necessary to sustain the fight against racism. It is not enough to learn about these issues in school and then move on. The process of unlearning biases and challenging systemic injustice requires constant engagement. People must be willing to read, listen, and evolve in their understanding. Activists, scholars, and communities continue to provide insights that expand awareness and push society forward. Education is not a passive act. It is an ongoing commitment to growth, to justice, and to the dismantling of oppression at every level. The more people learn, the less power racism has to divide and diminish. And the closer society moves toward a future where equality is not an aspiration, but a reality.